Some punishments are said to be worse than death. It's a phrase that gets thrown around, but what does it actually mean? Forget what you think you know about correctional facilities. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on prisons where the sentence is just the beginning of the punishment. El Buen Pastor Women's Prison, Colombia. In Bogotá, Colombia, you'll find a prison with a deceptively comforting name, El Buen Pastor, or the Good Shepherd. Despite its name, there was nothing comforting about the place. It was infamous for harsh living conditions and extreme overcrowding. Cells originally designed for 2 inmates were packed with anywhere from 10 to 20 women. According to the family of one former inmate, sexual violence and drug use were rampant. Corruption was deeply embedded in the prison's culture, with guards and inmates often engaging in illicit activities. A rigid social hierarchy existed among the prisoners, with the top spots occupied by those with powerful outside connections. Violence was a constant threat, and it wasn't just from the guards. Inmate-on-inmate rape was a horrifyingly common occurrence. For many, daily life consisted of being locked in a cell for 23 hours straight, with only 1 hour of movement allowed. If you wanted fresh air outside of that designated time, you had to have a legitimate medical emergency. Prison Styal, UK. In England, Prison Styal gained a grim distinction for having one of the highest suicide rates in the country, with at least 11 such deaths since 2007. The prison became a symbol of the system's failure to handle inmates with severe mental health issues. In December 2018, 18-year-old Annalise Sanderson was found dead in her cell, becoming the youngest female to die by suicide at Styal. The story leading to her incarceration was a tragedy in itself. She was arrested for stealing a pair of shoes and assaulting store workers. On the day of her arrest, she had poured petrol on herself and tried to drink it, a clear and desperate cry for help. Instead of receiving a psychiatric evaluation, she was sentenced to 12 months at Styal. It's estimated that 40% of the population at Styal has some sort of mental health issue, with up to 20% having a serious, diagnosable condition. Many were also dealing with drug addiction and past trauma. Instead of helping them, the prison's conditions only made things worse. La Mesa Prison, Mexico. Located in Mexico, La Mesa Prison is widely regarded as one of the most notorious prisons in Latin America. Though not exclusively for women, the conditions inside were a nightmare for its entire population. The primary issue was mind-boggling overcrowding. Originally built in the 1990s to hold a maximum of 2,000 inmates by the 2010s, that number had exploded to over 7,000. Personal space was a non-existent luxury. This chaos was fertile ground for corruption. Guards at La Mesa were known to take bribes, offering better conditions or even early release for the right price. This created a starkly unequal system. While most prisoners were squeezed into unbearable cells, a select few lived in relative comfort. In 2002, the situation became so blatant that police had to intervene and demolish a luxury condo that had been illegally constructed inside the prison walls for a wealthy inmate. Beyond corruption, the prison was a hotbed of violence. In September 2008, a series of riots erupted, leading to the deaths of over 20 inmates. Lowell Correctional Institution, USA. Across the Atlantic, Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida holds the title of the largest prison for women in the United States, with a population swelling to nearly 2,700 inmates as of 2015. But bigger didn't mean better. Lowell became synonymous with overcrowding, rampant inmate abuse, and systemic sexual misconduct. Here, correctional officers frequently abused their power, creating a toxic environment where contraband was king. According to one former inmate, Ginger Omen, sexual relationships with officers were a common, albeit illegal, form of exchange. A single pack of cigarettes, worth a few dollars on the outside, could fetch over $400 behind bars, and some officers were more than willing to trade them for sexual favors. This created a twisted internal economy built on exploitation. Any inmate who dared to report the abuse faced terrifying retaliation. They were threatened, thrown into isolation, and deprived of basic necessities like food, soap, and sanitary products. For some, the punishment was even more severe. A 52-year-old inmate named Cheryl Weimar got on the bad side of the officers. She was beaten so brutally that she was left paralyzed from the neck down. Heilongjiang Women's Prison, China. In China, the Heilongjiang Women's Prison earned a chilling nickname, the Cemetery of Falun Gong Ladies. The women sent here faced conditions designed to break not just the body, but the human spirit. It was a place of extreme psychological and physical torture. Li Jinping, a 43-year-old Falun Gong practitioner, was arrested at her home and thrown into this facility for refusing to renounce her beliefs. Inside, she was beaten, tortured, and forced to sit on a tiny hard bench for so many hours on end that she developed painful open sores. When she protested by going on a hunger strike, the guards only intensified their efforts to make her life unbearable. Even the most basic human functions were turned into instruments of torture. Another former inmate gave an account of her 6 years in the prison, describing how she was locked in a tiny cell for nearly 2 months, handcuffed to a metal ring cemented to the floor. For a year and a half, she was cuffed with her hands behind her back, hung by the handcuffs, forced to stand in the freezing cold, and beaten repeatedly. Inmates reported being under constant surveillance, even in the restroom. They were only permitted to urinate during the day, with bowel movements restricted to a window between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. Any deviation resulted in another beating. Tashkent Women's Prison, Uzbekistan. In Tashkent, Women's Prison, Uzbekistan, life for inmates was horrific, but even more so for those who were pregnant. It was common to hear terrible cries from the cells due to the horrific living conditions. Inmates regularly experienced different forms of sexual violence, including gang rape and torture by prison guards while being coerced into silence. Those who dared to speak out were beaten with truncheons and suffocated with plastic bags. But the treatment of pregnant women and mothers was exceptionally cruel. Women were pressured by prison staff to terminate their pregnancies within the first 12 weeks so they could continue working. For those who carried their babies to term, they were taken to a hospital about 10 kilometers away for childbirth, and the prison provided no care for them or the baby afterward. Mothers barely got to see their children, usually just 1 hour a day. And many times, when they did, they saw that their children had bruises, allegedly from being beaten by the prison staff. Parappana, Agrahara Central Prison, India. Parappana, Agrahara Central Prison in Bengaluru, India, was originally built with an all-male population in mind. Its very architecture was ill-suited for the female inmates who were later housed there, forcing them to adapt to an environment that was never designed for them. The facility is infamous for being severely overcrowded and dilapidated. Inmates were crammed into spaces meant for far fewer people, and basic necessities like clean water and sanitation were in desperately short supply. For pregnant women, life inside was a constant state of anxiety and despair. They were forced to sleep on the floor in cramped spaces, provided with only 2 bed sheets and a single pillow. The monotonous diet and tense environment took a heavy toll. As a result, many of these women suffered miscarriages or went into premature labor, their pregnancies ending in tragedy within the prison's crumbling walls. Haechon Concentration Camp, North Korea. In North Korea, Haechon Concentration Camp, also known as Camp 1, is less a prison and more a death sentence. Most of the inmates are political prisoners, sent there to be re-educated through hard labor. In reality, the sentences were impossibly long, and the conditions were so extreme that few survived. The camp operated like a nightmarish factory zone where inmates were treated as slave laborers. They worked grueling 18-hour days in shoe, leather, rubber, and clothing factories. Falling short of a production quota meant being forced to work even longer hours. The living quarters were infested with fleas, with 80 to 90 people crammed into just 30 square meters of space. Access to toilets was virtually non-existent, with a single toilet serving roughly 300 inmates. Showers were a rarity. Food was served in minuscule portions, and any inmate who broke a rule had their already meager ration reduced, forcing some to eat raw rats to survive. Punishment was brutal and frequent. Inmates were locked in tiny cells for days, beaten, kicked, and whipped. If a woman became pregnant, she was forced to have an abortion. Babies who survived birth were often killed immediately. The conditions were so relentlessly harsh that between early 2020 and August 2022, an estimated 40 out of 500 female inmates serving life sentences died. HMP Bronzefield, UK. HMP Bronzefield in the UK is one of the largest women's prisons in Europe. Its size might suggest a modern, well-equipped facility, but its reputation tells a different story. Bronzefield was built to house Britain's most dangerous female offenders, from serial killers to terrorists. But the danger within its walls often came not from the inmates, but from the institution itself. In 2016, a woman named Natasha Chin arrived at the prison. She had a severe medical issue that caused her to vomit uncontrollably for 9 hours straight. Her desperate calls for help went unanswered by staff. Within 48 hours of her arrival, she was dead. Her case wasn't an isolated tragedy, it was a symptom of a deeply flawed system. Pregnant women, in particular, faced horrifying neglect. An 18-year-old named Rihanna Clear went into labor alone in her cell. For over 12 hours, she received no medical assistance. After giving birth, with no tools and no help, she was forced to sever her baby's umbilical cord with her own teeth. By the time anyone from the prison staff arrived to offer aid, the newborn had already passed away. IK-14, Prison, Russia. In Russia's central region of Mordovia stands a prison so feared that its reputation precedes it. A sign at the entrance to IK-14 reportedly reads, "Welcome to Hell." Inmates who were condemned to serve time there took extreme measures to avoid it, a testament to its formidable and dreaded nature. There was a common saying among prisoners, "If you haven't done time in Mordovia, you haven't done time." In a letter published by a former inmate, she described slave labor conditions and rampant abuse. Women were forced to work 16 or 17 hours a day, with only 1 day off every 8 weeks. They slaved away for hours at sewing machines in rat-infested sweatshops until some of them literally lost their fingers. If an inmate dared to complain about her inability to continue working or disobeyed a guard, she would be taken outside and forced to stand in one spot in temperatures that could drop to 20 degrees Celsius. Welikada Women's Prison, Sri Lanka. "We are treated as far less than human." Those were the words used to describe life inside Welikada Women's Prison in Sri Lanka, the largest maximum security prison in the country. It suffered from an overcrowding rate of over 220%. In some cases, over 150 inmates were forced to sleep in a single cell, with barely any room to breathe. The prison was also chronically short-staffed. The officers were overworked, underpaid, and stuck in a dangerous environment, and they often vented their frustrations on the inmates. About 64% of the women here were first-time offenders, yet they were thrown in with hardened criminals, from murderers to those who had simply defaulted on a loan. Mental health support was practically non-existent. The heat was unbearable, with no air conditioning and only a few fans that feebly pushed the hot, humid air around. To make matters worse, the facility was infested with rats, flies, cockroaches, and bedbugs due to a complete lack of a proper garbage disposal system. Neve Tirza, Israel. Neve Tirza is the only women's prison in the entire country of Israel. This fact alone creates a massive problem. Every woman who commits a crime, from serial murder to shoplifting, is crammed within the same walls. The physical conditions were abysmal. Cells were infested with cockroaches and bedbugs. In a single cell, 6 to 8 prisoners were confined for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour to move around. The stench in the air was described as terrible. This constant confinement led many inmates to suffer from varying degrees of mental illness. The treatment was also harsh. After one riot, police reportedly sprayed tear gas directly into the cells causing many prisoners to faint. Others were beaten, while some were tied to their beds with restraints and chained so tightly that their hands swelled and they had difficulty breathing. Korchak Women's Prison, Iran. The Korchak Women's Prison, located in the barren desert of Iran, has earned a nickname that says it all: the torture chamber. The facility was converted from an industrial chicken farm, so it lacked the basic structures of a proper prison. It was packed to the brim, housing over 2,000 inmates, more than double its intended capacity. Inmates were not separated by the severity of their crimes. Murderers lived alongside political prisoners and petty thieves, creating a volatile and violent environment. Medical services were either scarce or completely non-existent. Torture was common, including sexual violence, and prison staff frequently resorted to beatings. Anyone who dared to complain about the terrible food or lack of medical care was punished by being thrown into solitary confinement. The food itself was a constant struggle. Inmates were served the same monotonous, nutritionally deficient meal every single day. In June 2022, the prison's state hit a new low when sewage overflowed into several yards, combining with the heat and overcrowding to attract swarms of insects and cause respiratory distress among the detainees. Holdsmore Prison, South Africa. Holdsmore Prison in South Africa is notorious for housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Originally designed to hold around 4,300 inmates, the facility now struggles under the weight of over 7,000, and that number continues to grow. Because of the extreme overcrowding, over 100 women were often crammed into a single room that had almost no air circulation, leading to constant tension and fights. The mattresses were described as stinky, the rooms had no working toilets, the sinks were clogged with only cold water, and the sheets and blankets crawled with lice. The cells were overrun with cockroaches. According to South African law, health checks are required for all prisoners upon admission. However, reports indicated that these women were not getting their annual checkups, leading to the widespread and unchecked transmission of diseases within the prison. Indiana Women's Prison, USA. The Indiana Women's Prison is the oldest adult facility for females in the United States, but its age has not come with wisdom. Here, a unique form of suffering emerged from a combination of outdated infrastructure and modern policy. 3 to 4 women shared cells that had no air conditioning, no running water, and no toilet. When the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, prison officials, in an attempt to curb the spread of the virus, began locking the cell doors, cutting off all air circulation from the hallways. What started as a public health protocol quickly turned into a form of torture. Inmates were forced to remain behind locked doors in their stiflingly hot quarters, begging to use a bathroom or get cool water to drink. With outside temperatures often hitting 90+ degrees, the heat inside the cramped cells reached unbearable levels. It became common for inmates to pass out from the heat, while others experienced seizures, all without adequate medical attention.